Good afternoon from Boston. Uh, for myself and Nigel and Emmaia, you're in New York, right? My name is Yasser Munif, and I'm joined by my colleague Nigel Gibson, and we are honored today to have Dr. Emmaia Gelman, who will address an important topic, and that is the history and role of Zionist organizations such as ADL, Hillel, and the Academic Engagement Network. And many of these organizations have been around for a long time, but gained prominence in the past several months due to the renewed repressive role in academia. So this event is sponsored by faculty and staff for justice in Palestine at Emerson and Jews Against Zionism at Boston Street. And if you'd like to join either of these groups, you will find information on Instagram, and you can contact us there. My colleague Nigel Gibson is a professor of political science at Emerson College and teaches courses on social movement, Fanon, Marx, and postcolonial studies. He is the author of many books about Frantz Fanon, including a very recent one published a few months ago entitled Frantz Fanon, Combat Reading, and get a copy. It's an excellent book. And I teach courses on social movement, gender, postcolonial studies, and the Middle East. And I do research and write primarily about Syria. And both of us are member of FSGP. We are really honored today to have Dr. Emmaia Gelman, and it's an honor for me to introduce you. Dr. Gelman is a professor in social sciences at Sarah Lawrence College and a founding director of the Institute for Critical Study of Zionism, which examines the political and ideological work of Zionist institutions beyond their direct advocacy for Israel. Her research and writing investigate the history of ideas about race, queerness, safety, and right, and their production as political levers in the realm of hate crime, policy, surveillance, anti-terror measures, and war. She's at work on critical history of the Anti-Defamation League from 1913 to 1990 as a Cold War neoconservative institution, as well as an edited book of social justice movement writing and academic research on resistance to the ADL. She is the co-chair of the American Studies Association Caucus on Academic and Community Activism, and a long-time activist in New York City on Palestine, policing, anti-racism, and queer issues. And I'm looking forward to learning from you, and we're truly honored to have you today. And so I will start with our first question. So at the beginning of the semester, we were informed by the administration that several organizations, ADL, Hillel, and the Academic Engagement Network, were invited to help fight anti-Semitism on campus. And they announced that they will invite other organizations to address Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian speech, sentiment, but they never followed up on that. Could you briefly describe the history of these organizations and their mission? What are they invited by university administrations around? Why are they invited by university administration around the country? And what kind of work do they really do?
Sure. Thank you so much for organizing this and for having me. I appreciate that so much. I'll just make one correction. I, like probably other people who are in this conversation, I no longer teach at the university, at the college that I was employed at last year, because why? It's hard to say, right? But I was unhired, and it seems likely possible that it has to do with Palestine solidarity work and anti-Zionism, and generally just making things, requiring a college to have to defend academic freedom rather than just sort of complying and letting things ride easy. So I don't teach at Sarah Lawrence anymore, but I am the director of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. And the questions that you're posing and that are so important and relevant to all of us across campuses right now are questions about how Zionism works. So that's there's never been a more urgent time to figure it out. So I'll start with the Anti-Defamation League. I don't want to go too far back, but I will say that there's kind of like an OG, like old school set of organizations that started out as Jewish organizations and became Zionist around or after the founding of the State of Israel. So the Anti-Defamation League is one, American Jewish Congress is another. And those organizations started out already on the right. They were not organizations that represented the sort of vision of US Jewish history that were kind of, that's like kind of our origin story that we're fed, which is like everybody got off a boat from the shtetl and then they joined a union and, went on strike. And that's why we have labor rights and, whatever. That is a real history, but that's not the history of the Anti-Defamation League or the American Jewish Committee. Those organizations were formed by people who were from the upper classes who had emigrated previously from different places, from Central Europe, not Eastern Europe, and their purpose was to control what Jewishness meant and to sort of take the leftness out of it and to return it to whiteness, right? So the reason that I go back as far as that, which is 1913 for the ADL, is because they've stayed doing that for their whole existence. It's been a settler organization. It's been a white organization. Doesn't matter like who they put on their letterhead or that they hire, George Salim, who is an Arab American, to run their civil rights program. He's a right-wing guy who came from the Department of Homeland Security, right? It's still a white organization. And it's been an anti-communist organization. It is, so, often there's this question of like, are people accusing these institutions of dual loyalty between the United States and Israel? No, nobody's accusing, or I'm not accusing them of dual loyalty. The thing that I think it's important to understand is that they are fundamentally colonial organizations, and the U.S. is a colonial state, and so is Israel. So it works for both. So the Anti-Defamation League, its sort of claim to fame, its turf, is anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism, watchdogging, right? And then this sort of idea of civil rights and democracy. I want to be clear that the ADL's history of doing civil rights work has always been kind of an instrumentalized one. Like, yes, absolutely, the ADL was involved and important in getting passed in the 50s and 60s, anti-discrimination law around employment or housing. But that kind of egalitarianism, that kind of colorblind advocacy comes to a hard stop when we talk about trying to actually change racist power. So the ADL's participation in the civil rights movement, which it likes to talk about a lot, puts photographs of Martin Luther King Jr. every opportunity that it gets. That civil rights participation came to a screeching halt at the time that Black Power started to demand more than sort of simple equality and started to make common cause with transnational anti-colonial struggles. That is the Anti-Defamation League that we're dealing with today. So when the Anti-Defamation League became invested in Israel as a colonial project, not as like a socialist liberation project, the idea of talking about anti-Semitism as a scourge that people needed to be on guard against became more important to it. Before, it had sort of tried to get people back into whiteness. Now, around the 70s, it started to like be really focused on claiming that Jews were marginal and insisting that being opposed to anti-Semitism meant supporting the state of Israel. Okay, that's enough of the history of the ADL. It has become sort of de facto the arbiter of what anti-Semitism is. And that's partly just because it has been a white liberal organization that the government could work with and point to and say, like, hey, the Anti-Defamation League says that, this is kosher and this is not kosher. So we're going to do we're going to implement the policies that it says are in opposition to anti-Semitism. And we know that those will support the imperial colonial aims of both the United States and Israel. It has also a very long history of doing work in schools. And that's because, it has, for its whole history, it was interested in education to try and get people to think one way or another. But during the Cold War, education became a really important site of anti-communist, anti-leftist work, right? People after the Cold War, the civil rights movement started to sort of develop at a national level, and there was an enormous amount of concern that it would be communist. And so having civil rights and anti-racist training, anti-racist education that was anti-communist was very important to the US state. And so the ADL became an education organization. That's, again, the ADL that we now deal with. Right? The ADL is probably in almost every school district in the country. It claims on its website to have contact with hundreds of thousands of teachers and students. And so when we have in universities question about like who's going to teach about anti-Semitism, the ADL has established itself through this incredibly long and deep history of education work and work with the state on the right in support of colonialism to do this. But in the US, we don't have that language of like, is it colonial anti-racism or is it liberatory anti-racism? We don't distinguish those things very well. So your DEI offices say, like, we need somebody to talk about anti-Semitism. Here's an authority on anti-Semitism, right? So that's why the ADL is so entrenched and why it's so difficult to sort of get them to get administrators to say no to them. Also, because obviously many administrators are interested in Zionism themselves. They're interested in, courting the donors who are Zionists. So the ADL is a useful tool for them to do that. The other piece of the ADL, which we don't need to talk about right now, is that it also runs an incredibly sophisticated and powerful public relations and political advocacy shop. And so if you try to say no to them, then you encounter the other arms of the machine, right? Okay, let's talk about Hillel for one sec. So Hillel is an old organization. I actually don't even remember when it was founded, but it was quite old. But it was sort of a cultural organization in the way that it pretends to be. It used to be, right? It used to be the campus organization that provided cultural and communal and spiritual services to students. In the 1980s, that changed, and I'm borrowing now from a history that is on the drophillel.org website. So you can read it yourself. I won't go through the whole thing, but an important thing that happened and that has happened that has been a factor in Zionist institutions' work since the 80s is megadonors. So organizations that are funded by megadonors, like wealth and right-wing politics tend to go together, and organizations that are funded by megadonors tend to reflect the politics of their megadonors. That's what happened to Hillel. So Hillel began to be funded by megadonors, and then it became kind of a tool for doing anti-BDS work on campus. In 2010, there had been sort of an effort to get Hillel to be more diverse, to be more open. In 2010, they shut the door. They adopted standards of partnership, which said that Hillel chapters on campuses could not partner with, house, or host any organizations that support BDS, that delegitimize or demonize or apply a double standard to Israel, which is Zionist talk for criticizing Israel, or who support BDS. So now Hillel has been entrenched on campus as a representative, supposedly, of Jewish students. It has enormous amounts of money, and it is enforcing a right-wing politics. And that's why we have all these Jewish students now trying to figure out, like, well, what else can I do, right? Because the institutions that were built for Jewish campus life have been captured and turned against us. So I encourage people to have a look at Drop Hillel. Last, the Academic Engagement Network. So this requires a little bit of background knowledge about how the Zionist ecosphere, institutional ecosphere, has worked. For a very long time, there were some, the big organizations kind of ran everything. The ADL, American Jewish Committee, AIPAC. There were some other organizations that have grown up, like CAMRA. Are they Jewish? Are they neoconservative? Are they Zionist? It's not entirely clear what their orientation is. They're all they're interconnected and they work together. When the BDS movement became kind of a an important player and began to be effective in the U.S. So around the middle of the 2010s, there was a strategy shift to try and counter it. So the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, was produced and taken up by Zionist organizations to affirm, probably nobody needs me to tell them, that that criticism of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism, and that supposedly Zionism is the self-determination of the entire Jewish people, despite the fact that I and every other Jewish person that I know thinks that Israel is the exact opposite of that. It's destroyed our families and our identities. But one thing that happened in the course of that is that the claim of anti-Semitism became incredibly powerful and leverageable. It became a foreign policy tool. It became a tool for moving capital. It became a tool for policing. And so the model that the Anti-Defamation League had developed of saying this is anti-Semitism and you have to bring us in to, to stop doing it, that model spun off into a ton of different organizations. Suddenly, it's not just the ADL, it's 1 jillion other organizations who are actually Israel advocates, but who are saying that they're doing anti-Semitism work. Among them is the Academic Engagement Network. The Academic Engagement Network was created in 2015. It was a project, and I believe it still is wholly a project, of the Israel on Campus Coalition. How do we know that? We look at tax forms. Tax forms are very revealing about what board members are involved in one organization and also in another organization, who's funding, etc. So AEN was created by the Israel on Campus Coalition. It affirms that it's an Israel advocacy organization, but it also pretends kind of that it's a DEI organization and it's campus climate advisor. It's part of a larger ecosystem that has created this idea of a crisis of anti-Semitism that then college and university administrators, like, they need a consultant to help them deal with the crisis of anti-Semitism. They also, I don't have like a paper trail for this, but just the way that institutions work is that when they identify that there is a legal or a fiduciary risk, a financial risk, that if they don't do something, that it may cost them something down the road, then their insurance companies tell them to do the thing, right? So if you have 1 million lawfare organizations filing Title VI complaints and lawsuits against colleges, and colleges need to be able to say, like, hey, we did something to prevent this. Don't sue us. You can't sue us. And the thing that they do is they bring in AEN. So we can talk about what AEN is doing: curriculum advising, training on anti-Semitism, and sort of inserting itself into DEI. But those are the histories of those 3 organizations.
Thank you, Emmaia. A kind of question from the other side, if you will, is the reality of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and the rising reality. Reports say it's up by 200 to 300%. So the question from the other side is, what's your experience and advice about the most effective ways to combat anti-Semitism and Islamophobia?
Well, I think it's very important. Let's start with anti-Semitism. They're not the same, right? So let's take them one at a time. So I think it's important with anti-Semitism to be clear what we're talking about. Obviously, there is anti-Semitism, by which I mean the targeting of Jews in a racial way, like as the sort of foreigner, the other, that exists. That is primarily taking place on the right. That's like a white Christian nationalist sort of oriented problem. I actually have no idea how prevalent or important anti-Semitism is from other populations. Is it endemic to other cultures and countries in a way that matters? I have not seen evidence of that. We have to take it all in its you can't sort of generalize about it. you have to look in each place that you might be concerned about it, right? But one of the claims of Zionist organizations is that Palestinians are anti-Semitic, also homophobic, right? I'm not denying that people have opinions and people are all different, but I have spent plenty of time in Palestine. People know I'm Jewish. People know I'm queer. It's fine, right? It's fine. And so the sort of fear mongering that conjures up an anti-Semitism crisis, I think itself really needs to be questioned. In the United States, the data that says that anti-Semitism is at crisis levels is Anti-Defamation League data. And they're counting like protests against the Anti-Defamation League as anti-Semitic incidents, right? And they're using the IRA definition. So we know that that's not accurate. What is the actual prevalence of anti-Semitism in the United States? Not a clue. I think that that's actually part of the problem, is that in order to really address anti-Semitism, first we have to like strip away the bullshit and understand what we're actually facing, right? So the idea that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is a terrible distraction from what's happening in the world of actual anti-Semitism. The partnership that's happening between Zionist organizations and the white nationalist, white Christian right is a terrible barrier to addressing anti-Semitism. And finally, a huge barrier to addressing anti-Semitism is that Jews who are not on board with what Zionist organizations are doing are really hard pressed to organize with each other. Like they're hard pressed to even find a space to be safely Jewish, right? You can't, like college students who are anti-Zionist can't go to Hillel to organize themselves and be a community. So what's left to them? Encampments were great for that, but and then encampments were not safe for people either because the police came in and tore them up, right? So if we're going to confront anti-Semitism, first we need to calm down and try and understand what's actually going on. Then we need to take it out of the hands of the organizations that are instrumentalizing it as a way of pushing either policing policy or colonial policy or trying to control universities. Then we can talk about how to confront anti-Semitism. In the meantime, the most powerful resistances to anti-Semitism that I have heard about over the last year have been in encampments, where people are putting themselves together on the line for a broad-based sense of justice and liberation, and that includes Jews. Okay. As far as Islamophobia, I want to point to a really useful webinar with Evelyn Al-Sultani and Nadine Neighbor and Amira Jarmakani and some folks from Parseo, Nina Mehta, and I can share the link in just a second. The conversation about Islamophobia has also been instrumentalized. The equation of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia has been damaging, right? We want to talk about anti-Semitism in order to sort of excuse the fact that we're doing that. We're also going to talk about Islamophobia. What it takes out of the equation is how anti-Palestinian racism is being papered over by conversations about Islamophobia, right? People are absolutely targeted as Muslims because they're Muslims, but people are you can't address the targeting of Muslims without also talking about what's the context in which they're being targeted, and increasingly the context is Palestine. So I would say that also for the purpose of addressing Islamophobia, we have to sort of strip away the ways that it's been instrumentalized and look at how the structures that we have built that sort of purport to provide safety have been denied to Muslim people. So, policing is not a safe solution to hostility. Dinners where we share different kinds of food is not a solution to hostility. I think that whatever the solutions are, we have to begin. I'll own that I don't know what the solutions are, right? But whatever they are, we have to begin discussing them by really talking about who has power and who is being targeted by power. And that's a conversation that Zionist institutions, when they come in to do DEI work, especially, immediately try to shut down. You can tell me if you want these answers to be shorter. I'm going to look up the link to that webinar and put it in the chat.
No, yeah, thank you so much. I mean, this is really helpful. And as you said, I mean, the dominant discourse these days is that the new anti-Semitism is on the left, that it's coming from the far left that supports Palestine, completely forgetting about Trump and the far right, and this whole discourse about George Soros being a Jewish billionaire who controls politics worldwide according to those anti-Semitic tropes. That is quite dominant in the far right and the Republican Party. So another question about the encampment last year. Administrators around the country used intimidation, threats, and police force to crush the Palestine movement. Could you talk about some of the strategies deployed by American universities to silence students, faculty, and staff who oppose and organize against the ongoing genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank?
Is the question about organizing protest, or is the question about intervening in the genocide?
No, the question is about the kind of strategies employed by universities to end those encampment and crush the Palestine movement.
Understood. Well, so, I mean, as you've experienced at Emerson, there is a new spate of policies and regulations, primarily regulating the time, place, and manner of protest. And the purpose of those, obviously, is to give the appearance that that policies are covering everybody, that they're about everything, but in fact, to police the particular political speech and organizing that we're talking about. I mean, the tactics are many. There's a conversation currently going on about who owns the syllabi, right? Is it faculty or is it the university who owns the syllabi? Because if it's the university who owns syllabi, then they are subject to attack in a way that if it's a sort of academic labor product, that it can be more insulated. So the universities are using control over their space, so time, place, and manner. They're using, obviously, control over student resources, but trying to, like, the fact that students who attend a university are kind of living in a company town, right? Like, where if you aren't on board with the boss, then you lose your access to food and to housing. So they're transforming the idea of the university as a place to come and learn to a place where the university can exert control. They're also using the physical space of the university, right? So I was saying I went to an event at Columbia the other day, and it was like trying to enter a jail. It's like I had to, basically like do like a face scan or something. I don't know. I didn't have to do that, but it was so the lockdown of physical spaces, which are spaces that are built by and dependent on the contributions, the intellectual contributions of students and faculty, and whose sort of lifeblood is the kind of interactions that that people have on campus that are questioning ideas and engaging with the world, and they're putting a cage around them and asserting ownership. This is obviously, they didn't invent it, but it's a very sort of neoliberal corporate approach to resources, right? Like our creativity, our intellect, our energies are the engine of civic institutions, and yet because they own the physical infrastructure, they're able to shut it down. They're also, I mean, I want to talk about the legal strategies as well. So we think of Title VI as, Title VI, just to back up, is the Civil Rights, Office of Civil Rights, like code that permits people to, the Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights Code, that permits people to file complaints against universities if they feel that their civil rights have been violated, and that the university didn't address it in a proper way. So to a certain extent, we think of those as attacks that are happening on the university. Complaints have been filed, hundreds of complaints have been filed in the last year alleging anti-Semitism, and alleging that university administrators didn't adequately address anti-Semitism, that are really cases about anti-Zionism and people trying to shut down protest against the genocide and the state of Israel. Those complaints are brought from outside. Important to know, anyone can file one of those complaints. Anyone who's on this YouTube stream can file a Title VI complaint about anti-Semitism or about Islamophobia or other kind of discrimination on any campus, whether they attend it or not. And the fact that they're so easy to file and that Zionist institutions have so many resources to sort of guide that and gather those has made Title VI cases a form of attack on campuses. I will say that you don't have to file them only about anti-Semitism. You can file them about anti-Palestinian racism, and people certainly have. You can also file them, you can file them about anti-Semitism coming from Zionist organizations, when Zionist organizations shut down, a Jewish protest or an anti-Zionist Shabbat or whatever. That is also actionable in a Title VI claim. Go ahead and file those, everybody. We think of those as attacks on the university, but you also have to see that to a certain extent they're being used by university administrations as a tool against protest, teaching, student activity that they see as threatening their donors, right? So if you have like a Bill Ackman, who's a mega donor to UPenn and probably lots of other places as well, and university administrators are concerned that if Bill Ackman doesn't like what's going on campus, he's going to yank his money. What's their excuse for violating academic freedom and calling the police on their students to contain that? Their excuse is that they are subject to lawsuit. This is theoretical. I actually don't know what's going on exactly at UPenn, but their excuse is that they're being subjected to Title VI complaints that charge anti-Semitism, so that they need to take care of that, and therefore they need to implement this and that policy. The number of university campuses that have adopted the IRA definition in response to Title VI complaints before the Title VI complaints were resolved or found substantiated, whatever, is many. They're using the fact of outside attack as an excuse to enact repressive policy on students. So those are just some of the tactics. And certainly bringing in the Academic Engagement Network and saying, like, we have a consultant. This is, the Academic Engagement Network has on its board really like gold blue chip board members. It has Larry Summers from Harvard. It has Donna Shalala. Was she the Secretary of Labor Education? I can't remember. She was the president of the New School. She was the president of Hunter College. That has really strongly credentialed people. And so when they come in and they say, this is the policy that we've been told to implement, like the administrators are not just receiving that information, they're also leveraging it against us. Long answer.
Well, I have another connecting question. In response to this embedding of the ADL and AEN into the administration's kind of, response to not only, obviously coming earlier, but also definitely in response to the encampments. Are there examples of faculty, staff, and students successfully forcing their institution to stop collaborating with these organizations?
I don't know of any. That doesn't mean no, right? Because one thing with another hat on, I have been an organizer of Drop the ADL. Not an organizer, a collective I don't know, a work group member. There's no real organization there. We created a resource and it lives online. It lives online at droptheadl.org. I encourage you to have a look at it. And one of the efforts that we were making was to say, like, okay, so once people understand that the ADL is a right-wing organization kind of masquerading as a civil rights organization, stop working with them. And in the course of doing that organizing, we heard from lots of people, lots of organizations, we really want to follow this up. Like, we didn't know this, now we know. We'd like to break off our relationship with the ADL, but we can't, because if we tell the ADL we're not going to work with them, like, we're toast, right? Like, they'll come after us in the press. They'll go to our funders and tell our funders to stop funding them. You know, like, it's too hot. What happened instead was that things went much more quietly, right? So if there was for example, a parent group that got their elementary school or whatever to stop working with the ADL, they didn't tell a soul. So we don't know, right? There's a sort of insulation in not publicizing that stuff. The other thing that's difficult is that people don't know who AEN is. There has been extremely little research and publicity about what it is. I hope that there will be more soon. I know that there's an article that's forthcoming in the journal, the Critical Ethnic Studies journal, about AEN. And I know folks are researching it, but until there's something to point to, it's just really hard. And a strategy that is absolutely worth thinking about and pursuing is, and that actually has worked in some cases as well, is having conversations, just conversations with your colleagues who work in DEI offices, right? If they're not the enemy necessarily, right? They're people who are trying to do their job and are being bombarded by disinformation from Zionist organizations who are trying to instrumentalize their positions. Having those conversations can be really helpful. Giving them an alternative to use can be really helpful. Parseo, which I mentioned before, is the Participatory Action Research, CEO, PARCEO.org. Parseo has been doing DEI trainings, essentially, on anti-Semitism from the perspective of collective liberation, meaning not anti-Semitism that's just about, like, everybody should, like, I don't know. First of all, it's not Zionist. Second of all, it doesn't treat anti-Semitism as if it's disconnected from every other form of racism, right? They provide trainings to university DEI offices. Simply offering that as an alternative may be useful. What do you do about AEN? I'm not sure, because by the time AEN has come to a university, that university, my feeling is that university is already trying, like, they already want it. So the intervention may not be providing more information. The intervention, it may have to be more, more of a resistance. There's also a legal case to be made. We're at the point where the administrators of civic institutions have so roundly failed to do what they're supposed to do, right? They've failed to protect academic freedom. They've failed to keep students and faculty safe on campus. They've failed to defend faculty who come under attack for doing their jobs. Like, they've failed as employers. They've failed as academic institutions. They're just, like, it's terrible, right? Those are, in some ways, actionable responsibilities. I know that our movement lawyers are exhausted and tapped out. Title VI is a very available tool. It may change under the Trump administration. The Office of Civil Rights has to investigate each claim and decide whether to press it further. And who knows what that office will look like under Trump. But right now it exists. So yeah, I can't be more specific about successful strategies, except to say that there are a lot. And I've heard lots of stories of conversations where people just talking to their colleagues in DEI has produced, has, like, revealed that DEI folks are kind of desperate, and we're not using our voices enough we're upset with what's happening. We're harmed by it, but we're not complaining. And Zionist institutions really are, and they encourage students to complain. They give them the language to complain, and there's funding for whatever funding is needed.
Thank you. That's really very helpful. So we have 2 more questions, and we might have more time. So if people attending this talk would like to ask questions, you can post them on YouTube, and if we have time, we'll address them. So the coverage of the mainstream media of the ongoing genocide in Gaza has been really, really terrible. Many of our students at Emerson study media and journalism. What advice do you have for them to cover the ongoing violence against Palestinians? And given that many of our students, perhaps like students at Sarah Lawrence, are in creative field, and what advice would you give to those wanting to continue to resist genocide as they enter these fields, the creative field and the media?
Yeah, I love the question and the possibility that it opens up. I mean, I think that, the question of how do we stop the genocide is like, I think we're all struggling with that. But the other question is, how do we use our voices in ways that are more powerful and can cut through the shutdown that mainstream media has imposed on this information? Well, first of all, I think that continuing to document, first, from the beginning, documenting has been incredibly important. I mean, the role of social media has been huge, right? We know that social media is increasingly policed, and that it's likely to be even more policed, especially if Musk is in the administration, the Trump administration. You can imagine what that's going to be like. One thing that has happened is that being able to tell those stories has also allowed people to narrate. And so I'll just go back actually to the Black Lives Matter moment, which was, to my understanding, my experience, like the first mass movement that really used social media and independently produced graphics and film, et cetera. The Black Lives Matter movement and its channeling of information through social media, to me, is why we understand on a popular level what settler colonialism is. Before that, I mean, I've been an activist for 30 years, and talking about settler colonialism was like considered wonky and weird and, like too out there. That was transformed by the Black Lives Matter movement and social media, and then following that, the Standing Rock protests. Being able to narrate independently using film and text together, to use your voices to critique the way, not just the news that's coming out, but the structure of news has, it is actually incredibly powerful and shifts. It shifts the sort of public receptivity to information. I mean, I think we all could identify that this has been a huge turning point in people's understanding about what's going on in Palestine. And the Israeli, I was listening to the radio this morning, I was listening to the BBC this morning, and the BBC presenter said something, was talking to a Israeli military spokesperson and said, like, this person says it's genocide, that person says it's genocide, it's not just human rights organizations. What do you have to say about that? And the official said, well, I could give you 5 people who say the opposite, that it isn't genocide, and you're just feeding it, whatever. Nobody believes that anymore, right? Like the Israeli sort of spin machine, like they're still doing it, and the BBC guy was like, all right, thanks for being on my show, and but nobody believes it. And the reason nobody believes it is because we have been able to counter narrate. So even though it feels like we're not winning, right, because the genocide is still going on, the public understanding of what's going on, I think, has really substantially shifted. And I don't want to say that like people who have just, spent however much money on their journalism degree should go and be influencers on social media, but like that's huge, right? The other thing that we know is that institutions that feel big, right, like a news organization or a college or whatever, are actually run by a very small number of people. And to change the minds of those people or to be those people is actually incredibly powerful. So even though we're sort of confronted by this massive infrastructure of corporations who seem hell-bent on never telling the truth, being inside them, being compelling, and having honed your ability to make an argument through the process of doing student organizing, I think is incredibly powerful. So the more concrete advice is like, please continue to to produce cultural work that explains this stuff. I will add, please continue to produce cultural work that is explicitly talking about Zionism, right? Not just talking about rights, not just talking about, like genocide and yes, all of that, but Zionism. We have the opportunity to uproot Zionism because it is showing its ass so hard. So continue to do that and popularize. Yeah, I think it's incredibly powerful. Last thing I'll say about that is that we need people inside those major institutions. We also need to build alternative institutions. So we can't depend on universities to educate anymore. We can see that, right? We need them for various things, but we can't depend on them. We can't depend on mainstream media to do the kind of propagating of stories that's needed. So be bold, make other organizations. Where the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, which just was created last year, has already been so thoroughly welcomed in solidarity with lots and lots of other institutions. It's clear that we can, if we build more institutions, we will have an infrastructure of our own and it will be big. So that's my invitation.
Well, thank you for that. It really spoke. I think many students would feel what you're talking about. They could work with that. In other words, it gives them agency in terms of what they can do, and not just simply, going to, how do you deal with an oppressive organization, but what you can do on your own, and the whole question of social media and giving voice and so forth. I'm going to ask a question that came up on the chat. I had a very general question for my last question, but I'll leave that to the side for a moment. This question's from Ida. I work at a university which is currently exploring implementing a blanket statement of institutional neutrality, which would prevent all faculty and staff from making statements on social and geopolitical issues. If they decide to implement this, how do you foresee the impact of this on further university organizing? Of course, you don't have a crystal ball, but perhaps your experience and knowledge would be important to share.
Yeah, I mean, I know that there have been pushes for institutional neutrality where departments, like the university won't make a statement about something, and departments won't make a statement about something. This is the first time I'm hearing about one that would prevent faculty and staff from making statements. And to me, that just sounds like unconstitutional on its face. I'm not a lawyer, but that sounds challengeable. I think that, what we've learned is that every tool that we develop to get around the power structure tries to take away from us, right? So like, just for example, this bill that was recently passed in the House that would allow the Secretary of the Treasury to strip 501c3 status from any organization that it decided was a terrorist organization without any kind of due process or whatever. That is an effort to strip away from us the possibility of having organizations that are outside the university or outside of other structures. Everything that we figure out how to do they're going to come around on the other end and say, no, you can't do it. But we still keep finding ways to do it, right? So if, for example, if it really came to pass that this policy were passed and it wasn't legally challengeable, I imagine that that the next move would be finding proxy ways to do stuff. So I'll give you an example, actually. So Cornell created has a policy where students who have been disciplined for for their Palestine solidarity activities can't have research jobs, right? And that's happened in more than one place, I believe. So what can happen is that colleges can hire each other's, faculty can hire each other's research assistants across campuses. So like Cornell students can't work at Cornell, but they can work at Emerson, right? So we find these ways to use our shared networks to to sort of escape institutional structures. So faculty can't make a statement. My dog is barking. Faculty can't make a statement about something, but sorry. But that doesn't mean that no one can make a statement about something. So maybe faculty find a proxy for it, or it's an organization, not a faculty, or like maybe the union makes the statement. I understand completely, like, this is repressive and terrible, but I don't think it does what it wants to do, right? It doesn't do what the university wants to do, because they can only control so far. Maybe that's not a helpful, I mean, that's not a counter-organizing strategy, but like, they don't own us, man. They don't own us.
There is a question from Celia Fisher. What do you think of the role of anti-Zionist Jewish people should look like in the pro-Palestine movement?
It's a good question. So I'll say first that I can't remember by what proportion, but the proportion of Zionists in the United States that are Christian is vastly greater than the proportion of Zionists in the United States who are Jewish. So, who has the power to do stuff? The reason that question matters, hold on one second. The reason that question matters is because the question about what should anti-Zionist Jews' role be partly depends on what our power is, right? Like, should anti-Zionist Jews be speaking up more forcefully, or like be at the front of the movement because our voices have the power to, like, shift things in a way that other people's don't? I think that at one point that might have been true. I don't think it's true anymore that we have that power. I certainly think that anti-Zionist Jews can play a role on a really personal level, right? If you have, like, again, let's go back to the DEI person who's like struggling with, like, do I listen to the American Jewish Committee, or do I listen to these like crazy, students who are on the quad? I think for an anti-Zionist Jewish student group or organization to go to that DEI person and say, like, hey, it's really good with us. You'll be supporting us by not implementing the IRA definition. That's a super important role. As a public voice, I really don't think it matters. And I think what is actually really helpful at this point is steering the conversation away from, is it about Jews or not, and toward, is it about the right? Because Zionist organizations have made super, super clear that they are in bed with the right. They're on the right. They're doing the right's work, right? Like Elise Stefanik at a congressional hearing suddenly endorsing the safety of Jews when she never gave two craps about Jews before, tells you exactly that this is a right-wing conversation. So if we can just talk about that if we can identify ourselves as opposing the right and not play so much into the question of, are we Jewish? Are we not Jewish? Do we speak as Jews? I think we may get out of this trap that only Jews are allowed to talk about it. That said, I just want to say one more thing, which is anti-Zionist Jews are in every organization, right? The Jewish anti-Zionist organizations are a thing. I'm not in any anti-Zionist Jewish organizations, but I'm in a ton of other organizations that I'm an anti-Zionist Jew. So, like, you don't have to be speaking as a Jew to be doing the work. All anti-Zionist Jews should be out there in the street all the time doing the thing.
Nigel, you had a question?
I do. I'm just wondering if there's any other questions that you're interested from the comments.
Can I just say that I want to read this one out loud? Is that, can I?
Go ahead.
Okay, this one from Laura. I want to advocate that folks try to highlight the way that Zionism is being used as a wedge to try and marginalize and limit speech in favor of justice issues from a gamut of progressive issues. So I think that actually speaks to what I was just saying, which is that that if we identify what's happening as a right-wing attack, right? If we look at, instead of when we're told, like, we don't, like, you're anti-Semitic and you don't support, like, students who want to learn about Israel. If we don't say, like, yes, and I'm not anti-Semitic and I do support students, like, if we don't do that and we just say, like, this is a right-wing organization that is making this claim, this is who their funders are, this is what their political project is, then we stop being pitted against each other. Thank you, Lara.
Okay, I have the final question, which you kind of intimated by mentioning Elon Musk, and the question is: do you think there'll be a fundamental difference in the repression and management of pro-Palestine organizing with the election of Trump? It's a big one.
I mean, yeah, I think that regardless of who was elected, it would have gotten worse. And now it'll definitely get worse, right? Like, I don't think, it wasn't like the Biden administration was holding back. One thing, I mean, it's sort of a mixed bag, right? Like, so the way that the Biden administration was going, I mean, it wasn't just the Biden administration, it was also Congress, right? Was enforcing the IRA definition, like codifying the IRA definition, using its power of funding to try and enforce crackdown. So, like, for example, saying that universities would lose public funding if they didn't crack down on protest, using anti-terror laws in a very selective way, and using nonprofit organizational and tax laws. All of those things are definitely going to continue. And that we know that one thing that the Trump administration is willing to do is, like, do really, really racist and violent stuff without having to couch it in anything, right? So I think that we can expect heightened militarization of police even more. We can expect that the Trump administration will, I don't know if they'll generate ideas about repression themselves, but certainly be willing to adopt them, and they'll be for sale, right? That's like another feature of the Trump administration, is like, whoever has the money gets the job. So that's why Elon Musk has the job. So I think that the risk that bigger and worse things will happen is certainly increased. And the other thing that we need to understand about Trump, which, I'm sure everybody does, is that he's interested in having corporate leaders govern, right? So to the extent that we are already confronting Facebook, we're already confronting Twitter/X, we are confronting, we live in an environment where surveillance and AI is basically unregulated, and the Israeli state is driving that. So I think we can expect a ton more of that. I think I would encourage people to look into the corporation called Cyberwell, which actually I believe has just partnered with AEI. Not AEI, sorry, AEN. Cyberwell is like a sort of Israeli state-connected anti-BDS tech company that, I don't know what they've partnered with AEN to do, but nothing good, I'm sure. So I think we can just expect all of those sort of modes of repression to escalate. So the real question is, like, what do you do about that? And I think two things. One is, it has already been clear that protest is great for gathering the community, great for articulating messages and being together, not great for shifting policy, right? So if there are additional crackdowns on protest, I think there's a point at which you start to think, what else can we do? Not what else can we do that's less confrontational, but what else can we do that is more subversive, right? And as far as the tech stuff is concerned, we already know that Signal is about to be compromised. Like there was some sale of Israeli tech that's like supposedly trying to crack Signal, right? I think we have to think about meeting in person. I think we have to maybe undo some of the sort of remoteness and the techness that we've become accustomed to, and that especially during quarantine became our MO, and think about how to connect in other ways. But we'll adapt. We'll be fine. I mean, we may not be entirely fine, but we'll figure it out.
Thank you very much. There is another comment from Lara, who says it's instructive that Ackman, Stefanik, and Chris Rufo are working together. The language of the sensitive issues which Trump listed that shouldn't be taught in public schools, like racism, because they hurt white people, is almost identical to the language in these bills and other measures to try to prevent discussion of Palestinian human rights on campus.
Yeah, so the Chris Rufo is the sort of architect of the anti-critical race theory backlash against schools, and they are. I don't know what work Ackman and Stefanik are doing with Chris Rufo, but I can tell you that the Zionist organizations led by the ADL are using the same exact arguments that the Christian right uses against critical race theory to try and suppress the teaching of ethnic studies, to demonize faculty, and to claim that teaching about Palestine, even mentioning Palestine, bringing Palestinian public figures into the classroom, is harming, blaming, and making white Jewish students feel bad, erasing Jewish students. So yeah, they're using the same arguments. What's really creepy about it is that they're still identifying themselves as essentially liberal, progressive organizations. And as long as we allow them to occupy that space, we're sort of inviting the right to take over our conversations about racial justice. Should I have this conversation about the Christian Zionism?
So yeah, one last question from Taki, asking if you could elaborate on the political factors that enable the dominant position of Christian Zionism. That is our last question.
I cannot. I don't know. I mean, I, like probably most of the rest of people on this call, when Trump got elected, was like, who are these people who voted for this guy? So I can't really articulate that. All I can say is that some of the claims that Western liberal societies have made about themselves, both the United States and also, I guess I would say, Israel to a certain extent, that they are secular, that they are sort of Enlightenment based, right, are crumbling. The people who said that were not fully in tune with what was going on the ground, and so we can't use those presumptions anymore to guide us. So, for example, the claims that we used to protest about rights, like, hey, you said everybody should have equal rights, like, but you're not giving equal rights to Palestinians. Well, fix that. Like, nobody cares anymore. Those things don't hold up. And once, as the phenomenon of Christian Zionism, which accompanies the phenomenon of the Trump election, just teaches us that that we need to use other tactics, and we need to disinvest in this idea that the state is going to be the answer, because it's clear that that's not happening. And that's what I learned from Christian Zionism.
Thank you so much for a really inspiring and informative conversation. I learned a lot tonight, and you were very generous. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate the time to talk. I wish we could be in the same room.
Likewise. Yeah, hopefully we'll have you over again in Boston.
In person.
Can I just invite that anybody who wants to know more about this or wants to get connected to any of the resources I mentioned, you're very welcome to reach out. My email is on the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism website, which is criticalzionismstudies.org. Totally reach out. Let me know what's going on. Thank you so much, friends.
Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you.